it wants to. It wants to make a fool of me, that's what it wants to do.
Yep. Doesn't like you, eh?
Nah. Welcome to this episode of Moving Our World. I have an incredible car behind me, and I guess incredible depends on what you like and what you're into, but as you know, watching this channel, I find absolutely everything fascinating. So, a 1947 Humber 10, and the reason this is interesting is because it was kind of a pre-war era car, I guess you could say, but after World War II, production ramps up and this was created. This was New Zealand assembled by Todd Motors, and Todd Motors was a place in Petone that also made eventually Chrysler, and they also assembled Mitsubishi eventually as well. The New Zealand car assembly history or car creation has kind of been forgotten, and if you ask any knowledgeable Kiwi about what cars are made here, they'll probably just say one thing, which is the Trekker, but we did have a whole bunch of things assembled within the country. It's got some unique features that I'll show you here really, really shortly, and I'm also going to do a voiceover and explain the history of Todd Motors because it is super interesting. It's a tiny little four-cylinder. It struggles up hills, but it was enough, and it's got some cool features that I think make up for its lack of power. So listen to my voiceovers, have a look at the features, and you'll get to learn a lot more about the Humber 10. The Humber 10 isn't exactly the most well-known car around. In fact, in New Zealand, it was created to skirt around regulations of the day. See, this model is also the Hillman Minx, of which 1,400 were made in 1947, the same year this Humber 10 was produced. While I can't confirm it exactly, it was likely that number of 1,400 cars was close to the maximum number allowed to be produced for the model in that year. And what's the best way to get around this rule? Why, rebadge the car, of course. Today, we focus on the Humber 10, its brilliance and its history. On that note, where did it come from? New Zealand is a relatively young country. Most of the major industry early on in our industrialisation was started by immigrants. Todd Motor Industries Limited was no different. The company was started in 1885 when a Scottish immigrant began Todd Corporation. By 1929, they had also evolved into car sales and maintenance, mainly now run by namesake and son, Charles Todd. At this time, they were a franchisee for Roots Group, which looked after Hillman, Humber, and Commer, three now extinct brands. By 1934, Todd Motor Industries was created, and a factory was built in Petone, New Zealand. This factory became the stalwart of New Zealand-produced motorcars for decades to come. Todd Motors focused on importing vehicles from both Chrysler and the earlier mentioned Roots Group, of which they would reassemble here in New Zealand. In 1947, this specific Humber 10 was made in Petone. It was one of 1,031 models produced that year. Now, this voiceover is really starting to drag on, so I'll tidy up the Todd Motors story. By the 1980s, they had developed their own oil and petroleum company in New Zealand, which was eventually bought out by BP. However, by the end of that decade, Todd Motors was bought out by Mitsubishi, and things started to wind down. By now, New Zealand was a different country. The rules had changed, and by August 1998, tariffs on imported cars were abolished. The New Zealand motor industry, or rather, the New Zealand motor assembly industry, was now dead. Anyway, back to the Humber. Look, I have to be honest with you. This is not the first time I've tried to film this car. I did a video a few months ago, but ended up leaving the GoPro on time-lapse for a majority of the filming. So here I am today with this piece of automotive history. Let's go through the features of a New Zealand assembled car from 1947. Now, realistically, the Humber 10 is a pre-war design, meaning it had great features like the wind-out windscreen, suicide doors, a basic side valve four-cylinder engine with a humble 1148.5 cc, which is rated at 9.8 horsepower, sprouting the name Humber 10. Now I can hear the children of today saying, only 10 horsepower? Well, yes and no. Alright, here goes another flashback. Ever heard of RAC rated horsepower? Look, neither had I, but it's not your average horsepower. For many years, right through to the 1960s, cars were advertised with their RAC, meaning Royal Automobile Club horsepower rating. And it turns out this was never based on the actual horsepower rating. Some manufacturers ended up badging cars such as 1665, for example, meaning 16 RAC horsepower, but 65 actual horsepower. But how does one calculate RAC horsepower? It's quite simple. An equation known as horsepower equals D squared multiplied by N divided by 2.5. Now D equals the diameter of the cylinder and N equals the number of cylinders. Let's use this equation on the specs of our Humber 10. D equals 63 millimeters, that's the bore of these cylinders, or 2.48 inches. Squared, this turns into 6.1504 inches. Multiply that by the number of cylinders, which we have 4. This equals 24.6016 inches. And divide this by 2.5 finally, and we end up with 9.84, or our 10 horsepower RAC rating. You see, I spent my whole life until now, at 30 years old, thinking that standard 10s and Humber 10s had only 10 horsepower. And while they won't break any speed limits, they definitely packed a bit more of a punch than a lowly 10 horsepower. Anyway, back to the features. The car has 16-inch wheels sporting 5-inch wide tyres, a Humber Hillman Car Club of New Zealand badge, a sizable trunk with room for a couple of period-correct suitcases, along with a spare tyre. It has an exhaust pipe the size of an average human thumb. It has 8 separate windows, including a windscreen that does what all windscreens should do, retract, as mentioned earlier. But no, seriously, check this out. Move the wipers out of the way, turn this knob, and out goes the window. Aircon is for suckers. And here's the action from the inside. Some Humber 10s came with a sunroof, but this particular one was spared such a fate, which is likely the reason it still exists today and hasn't rusted away. It's also got this beautiful hood ornament. It's got 6-volt headlights and 6-volt electrics in general. And finally, let's look under the hood. Notice that large round thing there? That's an oil bath air filter. Here's a bit more info on how they work.
So this is an oil bath.
Yeah.
You unwind that. So the air actually goes in through this slot through here.
Yep.
And it's sent straight down into the oil bath.
Okay.
And you've got an oil level indicator.
Yep.
So the oil level there is actually a little bit low.
Yep.
And then because it's going a 90 degree, all the debris that's in the air gets forced into the oil and it sticks there. And then the oil comes up through this mesh, goes through the mesh, comes back around, and then down through the carburetor, to the carburetor.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And so how often would you have to change the oil in the oil bath? Because it'd get filthy after a while.
Yeah, so if you're doing a lot of gravel roads or something, you're going to have to change it a lot more than obviously...
The engine is an 1148.5cc side valve 4-cylinder, obviously carburetor fed and cooled by a deep top water tank on the front mount radiator, which ensures the engine stays within operating temps at all time, most of the time. These cabin vents were standard affair in the day, yet all but forgotten in the modern era. The wind-up windows also have a glass insert at the top, a vintage monsoon guard, if you will. The fuel filler is on the rear left side of the body, and the filler neck goes directly through the trunk. It has external door hinges along with trafficators to show intent for turning. Now, this one worked great before we filmed, and then we turned on the camera and it decided to fail. However, with a bit of Fonzie effort, the trafficator was fully erect. And how do they work?
So there's a magnetic coil winding there, so when you switch it on, it pushes it up, and then there's a little light bulb in there, and that lights up, and that's your indicator.
Okay.
Now, my favorite feature, the quick action dipstick. This is mentioned a few times in the manual, because who doesn't want to check their gearbox oil whilst driving? Great feature. Other than that, this thing was entirely basic. It had rope handles for the passengers, ashtrays all over the show, and to be honest, I think we've finally run out of features. But let's get to the engine and the sound. After this, I tried to drive the Humber 10 for myself. Actually, it's capable of being hand cranked, But no matter what I tried, it wouldn't work. We went in for the electric start. Oh, choke?
Yeah.
And that didn't really work either. No problems, maybe we had just drained the battery. Push start to the rescue. And it finally worked. Oh, maybe not. We eventually got it running though, and headed back to finish the filming session, thus concluding my Humber 10 experience. The history is fascinating, the features are even better, but the drive, to be honest, was a bit underwhelming. And it turns out that's not the fault of the Humber. In the filming process, we had knocked a couple of things around in the engine bay, which meant it didn't want to run properly. Of course, well after the filming session was over, we discovered these issues and sorted them out, and it ran perfectly. So maybe my proper Humber 10 drive review will just have to wait. I hope you've learned something. Thank you for watching this episode of Moving Our World. Please subscribe, comment, let me know what you think. Do you have a story about New Zealand automotive history? I'd love to see it in the comments. Check out my other channel, Small Bike Stuff, if you're into small motorcycles. Otherwise, I'll see you next time on Moving Our World. Thanks for watching.